I declare the Council Agenda Briefing Forum of the 24th of May 2022 held in Council Chambers at the City of Subiaco open at 5:31 p.m. Welcome councillors, staff, the media and members of the community. On behalf of the City of Subiaco, I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the area. We welcome their cultural connection to the land and waterways of Subiaco and their continuing contribution to our city. We pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Please note that this briefing session is being live streamed and recorded, and by being present at this meeting, members of the public gallery consent to the possibility that their image and voice may be live streamed to the public. Attendances, apologies and leave of absence. At present we've got one councillor unaccounted for, that's Councillor Stroud, and I'm sure she's not too far away. We don't have any formal apologies, and as far as I know, no one's applying for a leave of absence this evening. Councillor Powell's attending by Zoom, and that's probably a good point to mention that we're still in hybrid mode, meaning that a number of councillors and staff will be attending remotely whilst the remainder will be here in person. Okay, disclosure of interest. I understand we've got at least one, and that's Councillor Hammersley.
Yeah, thank you. I, Angela Hammersley, wish to declare an interest in item C7, and the type of interest I wish to declare is impartiality pursuant to clause 22(2) of the Code of Conduct for Council members, committee members and candidates. The nature of my interest is I am a member and user of the Subiaco Library. Thank you.
Okay, no other disclosures? Right. Okay, there's no approved deputations tonight, and that would bring me to announcements by the presiding member. I will make a quick announcement. I've got a very important engagement to go to tomorrow. It's the National Simultaneous Storytime. It's an annual event held by the Australian Library and Information Association, and every year a picture book written and illustrated by an Australian author and illustrator is read simultaneously in libraries, schools, preschools, childcare centres, family homes, bookshops and many other places. So fortunately I'll be reading the story in question at the Subiaco Library. The notice on the City of Subiaco's website says, come and join special storyteller, the Mayor of Subiaco, David McMullen, as he reads the same book. More than 1 million children all over Australia will be listening to at the same time. And that book is a book called Family Tree, written by Josh Pike and illustrated by an illustrator by the name of Ronna Joy Gosh. It's a heartfelt celebration of family, community, the seasons of life, to both cherish and to share. Some very complex themes there for young children, so hopefully I'll get through it. But on to the business of the evening, and that's the agenda briefing. Okay, there's a few officer reports here, and we'll just go through them start to finish, beginning with C1, which relates to 3 Cross Street, Shenton Park, a 2-storey single house. Any questions about that agenda item? Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. Look, I'd like to ask a couple of questions about, it's page 13 of the agenda, and it refers to solar access. I noticed that the original plans did have an impact on the southern neighbours on their outside living area, but this has been somewhat mitigated by changes to the plans. However, it still appears that there's going to be shadow on the southern neighbour on their roof and perhaps some other outside buildings. I'm wondering what sort of effect that has on their access to solar, as in regard to, if they want to put up solar panels or if there's any solar collectors, that would affect them in that way.
Acting Director, Community and Development.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. This is a difficult lot to consider overshadowing because of the nature of the lot. It's an east-west lot, so any development is going to have a greater impact on the southern property just by the lay of the land. Now, what we've done through the planning assessment of the application is try to reduce any the impact of overshadowing as much as possible on outdoor living areas and habitable windows and spaces, or habitable room windows. So any overshadowing which is on a roof space has very minimal impact on the users of that property. It is where overshadowing is on outdoor living areas and habitable rooms, and we've tried to reduce this to a compliant wall or fence as much as possible. So that, and I can refer to the Manager of Planning Services, Anthony, if he can provide any more detail on that.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Just to respond a bit more detail to your question, Councillor Powell. So the Residential Design Code doesn't contemplate, future protections of, systems that don't exist at the moment, solar systems, notwithstanding, given it's an east-west lot and the way that the roof form exists and the elevations for that particular dwelling to the south, there would be sufficient space for the neighbour to install solar panels, which is at the optimal north-facing element that are not affected by the shadow.
And if I may, through you, Mayor, ask
Carry on.
A follow-up question. It's in relation to, look, I'm a bit confused. Is there a dividing fence, and is that fence 1.8 metres high, and does it cast a shadow? I'm a bit confused about whether there is actually a fence.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Yes, so there is a fence. So I guess the reference to 1.8 metre high dividing fence, so that's the typical fence height for a dividing fence. So that's typically the reference that's used across, that we use in our assessments, and it's used by the local governments as well as being what's, I guess, the measurement for the standard impact. So yes, there is a fence there. I think it's about 1.8 at the moment. But I guess if you look at the way the calculation and the overshadowing has been demonstrated by the applicant, the proposed overshadowing by the amended proposal, which is being considered by Council tonight and also next week, the impact on the outdoor living area is no greater than the 1.8 metre high fence.
And if I may, just one further question on the overshadowing. In relation to there was a building there before, it's been demolished. Why is the footprint of that building relevant at all to the new building and the effect it might have on overshadowing? Why is something that doesn't exist anymore taken into account in this planning process?
Thank you, and through you, McMullen. So essentially the city officers took the position that there was a house that existed on that particular site, the subject site, up until a few months ago. That particular building was an older building that had a higher floor-to-ceiling height on the ground floor. For context, we provided a diagram that showed the relative impact of what that particular house impacted the property to the south. And it's reasonable on planning grounds to consider what existed there, recently in the context of considering this particular application. And as demonstrated in the various figures in the officer's report, the proposed overshadowing, impacts the same window that would have been impacted otherwise if the building was to be retained.
No further questions from Councillor Powell. Okay, if no one else has any questions, I think Councillor Stroud.
Thank you, Mayor. It's funny, how you can read these things over and over again and see them, and then something pops out at you after all these years. Or maybe I've asked the question before and forgotten it. But in relation to the advice notes and in relation to point 4 about external fixtures such as air conditioning units, I notice the emphasis in point 4 is about their visibility, which is quite understandable. But I've noticed that complaints have come through about the noise. And I wondered why there wasn't any focus on the noise aspect. So thank you, through you, Mayor.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. That's because that's considered under environmental health noise regulation. So while you can, this is a planning consideration about the visibility of the streetscape and the public realm, the way that it operates from a noise perspective can be appropriately dealt with by the environmental noise protection regulations.
Okay, but then the process would be that would be dealt with later if there was an irritating noise. So why don't we at least recommend, even in our advice notes, if we can't do it in our planning conditions, the consideration of noise in the location? Because obviously a neighbouring air conditioner, particularly outside somebody's bedroom window, even that location is a consideration versus it being positioned somewhere else where it might be more outside the kitchen playroom area, you know. So I just wondered whether we could start thinking that way and whether we could put it in as an advice note. Thank you, through you, Mayor.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. There is an advice note about exterior fixtures which generally guides where they should be proposed and placed. So that's advice note 3. So we'll take that information on board about providing more information about the environmental health noise regulations.
Councillor Powell.
Yes, look, thank you. Just one final question, but this one doesn't have to do with overshadowing. That's but it's in regard to the transport and infrastructure report that in regard to parking, that it comments that it's worth mentioning that the sight line is not compliant with the southwest vehicle access point, and that the TID would recommend a 1.1 metre truncation there. I was wondering how is that problem being dealt with?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So that would have been provided, those comments were provided, I guess, as part of the original planning application, the original set of plans, and that's been taken on board with the amended plans that have been submitted for consideration.
No more questions? Right. Lucky last. Councillor Burns.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor McMullen. I'm a bit lost. We are on Heytesbury, aren't we? Correct?
Not yet, but if there's no more questions on C1, let's move on to C2, which does relate to 129 Heytesbury Road, Subiaco. Just for the benefit of any observers, that's an item which was deferred from the last council meeting through to this month's OCM. It relates to additions and alterations to an existing single house, and we'll start with some questions from you, Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Chair. Look, just for everybody's attention, I know you probably saw from the adjoining owner to the east, Roger Fletcher, an email that came out this morning, but one's just come through at 5:28. If you're not looking at your emails, that reads, hi councillors, further to this morning's email, and on reflection, Helen and I are not seeking to overturn the planning recommendation. We recognise that the flipping of the design creates additional buffer at the rear of the neighbours immediately eastern side of the development. We do not speak to the neighbours of the south units. They haven't spoken to the same neighbours. But basically, they're withdrawing their original comments, but they do make reference to wanting to look a little further between now and next week as to the vegetation that is shown on the plan. This is just interpreting what they're saying, which would be those 5 trees along the tree line. So most of you probably haven't seen that because it came in at the same time the meeting started. Okay. Will that do? I know that's not a question, and I apologise, but it's probably best we know that people aren't reflecting on the issues that were raised this morning.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that to everyone's attention, Councillor Burns.
Okay, I might have a question later, but for now, I just saw it a second ago, so I'm just bringing it up. Okay.
Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. Can staff address the changes to the overshadowing of 112 Hensman that have been, how that has been affected by the amended plans?
Acting Director, Community and Development, if there's anything you can add to the advice in the report, then we'd be happy to hear it. Sorry, Mr. Denham, I'm advised that you're best placed to comment on this particular development.
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So in the officer's report, we've got a number of figures for council to consider. One of them is figure 8 in the report. That demonstrates the extent of the shadow cast by the previous proposal in blue, and what is now cast by the proposal in yellow. That is owing to the additional setback by another 100 millimetres to the north. Also dropping of the top of the roof, so it's like a little drop lip to reduce the height, which reduces the shadow. And also for context, we've provided a diagram in brown, a line that demonstrates what a permitted 4 metre high wall with appropriate setbacks to the western and eastern boundaries and to the right of way would impact relative to what is now proposed. It's probably worth noting that the permitted 4 metre wall would actually impact more of the bedroom to the west that you can see at the bottom left-hand corner of figure 8 than what is actually proposed. And you can see that relative to the blue shadow of what was previously proposed, a number of other openings have been protected. So there's only one opening now that's affected by overshadowing, but that is less than the impact would be than a permitted 4 metre high wall.
Mr. Denham, I've got a question, and it flows on from the email that Roger Fletcher sent through to all councillors at 5:28 p.m, the one that Councillor Burns was referring to a moment ago. Have you seen that email? I'm just looking at the recipients now. Okay.
Thank you, and through me. No, I haven't seen that email, no. Not that one.
Okay. Look, I'll just forward it to Mr. Petrovsky as we speak, and he can forward it on to you. Actually, you know what? I'll forward it to both of you. There's just a statement in there right towards the end that says, we are seeking conditional approval, noting adherence to stated setbacks and vegetation screening as committed by the proponent. My question's around the vegetation screening. Have there been any commitments by the proponent as to vegetation, and are those commitments reflected anywhere in the recommended conditional approval? Because on a cursory look a moment ago, I couldn't find a corresponding condition that referred to commitments regarding vegetation screening.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. On the development plans, they are showing indicative landscaping, and there's nothing that's been captured in terms of, I guess, our assessment relating to that. But given it could be linked to, I guess, concerns if council was to still have concerns regarding building bulk and visual privacy, that is a consideration that they could you could form to require a landscaping plan be submitted, which requires, some vegetation along that particular portion, and that could be achieved prior to issue of a building permit. But there's no requirement there's nothing in the development plans as they sit today that show detailed elements of that landscaping proposed.
Sorry, could you just repeat that? Are you saying there is vegetation shown on the plans, but not detailed vegetation?
Yeah, that's correct. So on the one of the floor plans, it's showing, shrubbery or vegetation of some sort, but it's not defined. So we wouldn't know the species and heights and things like that. So it's just indicative at this point in time. But like I said, there could be a condition that's imposed requiring a landscaping plan be submitted, which requires certain attention be focused on certain areas of that particular lot.
And I'll just jump in there to say that we do have the screening condition that is linked to the residential design codes as condition 7 of the development approval. So generally where there's a requirement under the R codes, that's enforced through a condition of planning approval, and there's a clear planning and policy requirement for that condition. If council was of the mind to impose any other condition, it will need to really consider the validity of the condition and test whether it's reasonable on planning grounds to impose a vegetation screening condition, how it will be implemented, and whether it's reasonable for a single residential property for that to be imposed.
Thank you. Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Petrosky. Look, I take your point and fully understand the codes, but, I get a little, and I'm not suggesting by any means the proponents are trying to mislead us, but, if you look at the plan, and for anybody that's not looking at it's in the attachments on page 19, and basically where these major changes have been made to obviously satisfy the neighbours to the east, to the extent they've withdrawn their objection of this morning. If you look at it, it says to me you're getting 5 big trees. Arguably. Now, in a legal sense, that doesn't mean you're not getting 5, seedlings. They're going to take forever to grow. So I believe when somebody puts forward a plan like that and does indicative vegetation, even outside of the acting director's comments with regard to the R codes, I don't, and I might foreshadow that between now and the council meeting, that I might not put forward something in of the nature of a more descriptive vegetation that actually is reflective upon what we're being presented with. Because I don't like the idea of seeing, they're large trees, large mature trees. And if that's what we're being shown that we're getting, I don't think the idea is the plan saying, well, this is what we're going to approve, but you're going to wait 20 years before they grow back to that. Now, arguably, it may be a bit cheeky, but that's my nature. So I just foreshadow that you're going to find between now and us going to council that I'll do a little research and find something that's appropriate, that I believe is appropriate, and hopefully fellow councillors might want to, there's arguably trees aren't one of my big things. Well, I like them, but I don't know a lot about them. But I might speak to some of my fellow councillors and see what's actually appropriate as been indicated by the plan, because that's, when we're being told to, and this is still a question, sorry, but before I'm about to be pulled up, okay?
Councillor Burns, I'll take it as a statement of opinion and a foreshadowing of the possible amendment if you think it necessary.
If there were, okay,
I'm going to look to the other councillors for any questions, and just a reminder that we're asking questions tonight that are going to help us form opinions about how we might be minded to vote next week.
My question really was,
Councillor Hammersley. We'll go to Councillor Hammersley and then we'll go back to Councillor Burns.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. I was just looking at that figure 8, and I think I heard, and I think I understood from reading it, that there's been 100 mils additional setback, and you can see that that makes a difference. I'm just wondering, do we know how many more mils it would take to actually not overshadow that window?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Just in response to that question, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it would appear to be about just under a metre for the portion that's impacting the bedroom. But as I noted previously, that particular room has less shadow overcast by it than what a compliant wall would, and the applicant has amended the plans to drop the roof height, and you can see that in figure 7 to see how that drop roof has resulted in an improvement in the overshadowing of the southern adjoining property.
Thank you. Just so I understand then, so because what I was looking at was the blue, and it looks, you know, like I don't know, a small amount. Well, an amount equal to the blue that's beyond the yellow would take it in front of that window. So I was thinking it was just the 100 mils, but I think what you just said was it's the 100 mils plus the sloping roof that's had the effect.
That's correct.
Thanks for that. Another question is just looking at the plans, and it's on the attachment. It's the PDF page number 54 and 55. It's just some of these rooms have dimensions on them that tell us how big they are, and others don't. And I was just wondering, are we able to find out how big or what the dimensions on the rooms are? So that's in particular the area that makes up the garage, and the bedrooms 2 and 3, and bathroom 2, outdoor living area, laundry, and then downstairs the garage, the rumpus room. So are those figures available, and if so, can the elected members have them?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So they're not required to be shown on the development plan. So the Residential Design Codes Volume 1, which deals with single houses and group dwellings, doesn't deal with internal amenity the same way that R Codes Volume 2 deals with internal amenity, which focuses on room, bedroom size and things like that. So it's not a planning requirement under the R Codes Volume 1, but the city does an assessment, I guess, in terms of the garage space. We do an internal assessment to make sure that the car bays are the appropriate size and the like.
Thank you, and I'll add to that to say that we consider the plans and they are to scale. So we will have information on how big those rooms are, and we can look to getting that to elected members if that would assist.
Councillor Burns, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. And just, it's not a question, but to follow up on Councillor Hammersley's point, if you actually zoom in, there are actually some internal dimensions, like for the living room, etc. So you can actually get a pretty good idea of squaring off yourself on how big those rooms are by looking at some of the internal dimensions if you take a look at them. But I do appreciate staff offering to do it. Look, I'm just going to hold back. I don't know that I actually had a question. I think you just presumed I did. So I might just hang back and see how the conversation goes at this stage, if you don't mind, Member McMullen.
Councillor Jennings, you had your hand up and now it's disappeared. Do you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, I do. I don't know why it disappeared. Sorry, I didn't get rid of it, but thanks. And through you, this staff may have answered this question when this came up previously before council. I'm sorry if I'm repeating the question and we have to suffer through the answer. Well, won't be suffering, they'll give a good answer, but people have heard it before. With the setback on the rear, on the southern boundary, and it says they're allowed to have 4 metres high wall, that would be compliant. Where does that compliance or that allowance come from? Because in the R codes, tables, the table 2A, I think that applies a wall with no openings, but even, the other, 2B, both of them, if I read them correctly, have some setback requirement. So where does that come from? Is that in our planning scheme, local planning policy, or have I misinterpreted the R code tables or the applicable provisions in the R codes? Thanks.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. No, you haven't misinterpreted it. So there is a section under section 5.1.3 of lot boundary setbacks. So if a wall was to abut a right of way, there's certain allowances they get or concessions that are given for increased lot boundary setbacks, essentially, because a right of way essentially acts as an additional buffer. So there is a clause in there that allows percentage up to half the width of the right of way to be added to the setback requirement, which is why that's the way it's been calculated.
Councillor Burns, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm ready to ask that question now. There was some mention before, Chair, about the alterations to the southern boundary and its interaction with the sewer line, which I don't find on any of the plans. Could staff through you inform me where the sewer line was, and was the alteration to the plans in setting back the garage a causation of statutory requirements, or was it through the generosity of the proponent?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So with the sewer line, there's no easements affecting this property. So I guess the city's information is that there's no easement that affects the design of the building. It would, if there is a sewer pipe that runs on the property that's not an easement, that would be up to the applicant to consider as part of the design and construction of the building. It wouldn't necessarily be a planning consideration that would impact the consideration of this application this week and next week.
Thank you, Anthony. So just for absolute clarification, there's been no alterations to the current design that you're aware of, besides personal choice, that was an interaction with the city as to water corp, etc.
That's correct. So we haven't asked the applicant to amend the design based on any easement or any sewer pipes that run through the property, any planning issues.
All right. Thank you very much.
Councillor Hammersley.
Thank you. Just to get back to the imaginary 4 metre high wall of 18.9 metres with a 1.2 metre minimum lot boundary setback, does that wall have any openings in it, or is it just a completely blank 4 metre wall?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen, that would just be a completely blank wall by the calculations that were done.
Okay, no more hands up at home. The last question from Councillor Hammersley.
So, thank you. So, if there was to be a 4-metre wall built that did have openings, so for example, if you wanted to put some bedrooms looking out there, what happens then? I think from memory, I'd have to go back and look it up, but you probably can answer it straight up. How much further setback do you have to have if you've got openings?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. If the wall had openings, then there would be a greater setback requirement. I don't have the exact number to hand, but that's typically how the R code setback requirements work. So walls that don't have major openings, typically just highlight windows and the like, they're considered differently to walls that have windows to say bedrooms with typical openings. So I guess the assessment's just done on what one option of being a compliant wall would be. I hope that answers your question.
Go on.
So, would a garage door be an opening, or is that only windows?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So no, garage door is not considered an opening. So a major opening is basically a standard window or a door to like a kitchen, bedroom, study, dining room, lounge room. A garage door is, whilst it's an opening, it's not considered a major opening for the purpose of a setback requirement assessment.
Councillor Stroud.
Thank you. I just want to follow up that about the 4-metre wall and openings. So, so is it that they only consider a setback on a 4-metre wall with windows because they're considering a visual privacy consideration and not an overshadowing? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So yeah, basically a wall with no major openings can still have windows in it, but it's limited in terms of its visual privacy impact. So it's not a traditional window, as opposed to a wall that would have openings, which would have more of a visual impact on adjoining properties. But for the purpose of assessment, the figure 8 demonstration is the shadow cast from a wall. And that is based on a wall with no major openings of what could be achieved.
Thank you, Mayor. So it does seem a bit of a shortcoming in the planning codes that the risk of the overshadowing is not considered. Would I be right in assuming that?
I can do that. And thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. No, the risk of the overshadowing is considered in the overshadowing requirement, so it's separated from visual privacy and setbacks. So you don't, when you're doing the assessment, you're assessing it under all of the requirements of the R codes, which is why there is discretion available, because sometimes a greater impact on one provision can impact your assessment with visual privacy, for example. So overshadowing is still considered by the R codes, it's just a different provision.
It's a question I sent out this afternoon. I appreciate there wasn't time to answer it, but I just wanted to confirm, and it came from a email this morning that apparently has since been withdrawn, but there was a comment that the neighbour wasn't owner-occupied. I think from that the implication was that the owner had not had an opportunity to provide feedback. And so I just wanted to confirm with staff that the owners of properties are contacted through obviously the contact information that they provide as owner and ratepayer, and they would have had an equal opportunity to provide feedback on the development. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen, that's absolutely correct. So in our public consultation processes, both owners and occupiers are notified of proposals. What's happened in this instance is that once we've received feedback, any correspondence on amended plans was undertaken with the persons who provided their feedback, and that's how the process continues in accordance with the city's local planning policy. But absolutely, owners and occupiers were both notified.
Looks like there's no further questions in the chambers and no further questions at home, so we can move on to item C3, proposed amendment to LPS 5. Any questions about that item? Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mayor, the city and staff spent quite a bit of time developing local planning policies in the Shenton Park precinct and the other precincts affected by the modifications to the LPS 5. How will that protect, how will those local planning policies protect the residents at Wayland Street who are making this application for a scheme amendment? How would their property be protected by these policies that we spent quite a bit of time on?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So, in preparing the policies, we modelled many of our residential streets, and the premise of the policies is to shift building bulk and the scale of development away from the lower density areas. So we did this through transition areas and increased setbacks, and also considering building height with an appropriate transition to neighbouring lower density zones. So the way that the policies are set up is that in this instance, if there was to be a high density development, the local planning policies push the bulk and scale of that development closer to railway road rather than the lower scale density properties to the east.
Councillor Powell, carry on.
Sorry, if I could just follow up on that then. Sorry, I'm just trying to formulate my thoughts here. The applicant makes a reference to nearby developments, and I presume by that he's probably talking about, or they're probably talking about 97 Evans Street, and the fact that the local planning policies there, it was argued by the applicant that they could not be prevented from developing their lot to the full. And so therefore the local planning policies really had no bearing or no effect. They couldn't stop what the developer planned to do. Could you address that as, sort of as an issue that's being put by the applicant for the amendment as well?
Thank you, and through your presiding member. So local planning policies under the state planning framework need to be considered with due regard, and what is typically considered is how relevant that local planning policy is, how it's been prepared, and is it consistent with ordinary planning principles and proper planning principles. What I would say is that development that has occurred in neighbouring areas has been generally consistent with our local planning policies. It hasn't been so inconsistent that it's been contrary to the local planning policies. So absolutely the local planning policies have a role to play in shaping built form and development, and decision makers need to give them appropriate regard. It would be the same regard that you would give to the state planning policies, R codes, and other planning documents.
I suppose what I'm trying to get to here is the Minister has said, I think has been reported as saying that local planning policies are the way that the community will gain trust and confidence in the planning system because their voices will be heard at a local level. And yet there appears to be a very different argument being mounted by developers that in fact those local planning policies cannot impact on their ability to develop their block. Is there essentially who's right? Are the developers right, or is the government right?
Thank you, and through presiding member, there's how do I frame this? There's no right or wrong answer in planning, which is a difficult thing. So it's all about justification of your argument and the planning principles in which you create your planning documents. Now, guiding good development would go through a series of processes, starting from the objectives of our strategy, the zone objectives and the scheme objectives, through to the local planning policies which guide the built form on the ground. Now, there's a reason why there's a state administrative tribunal where people don't agree, decisions go through that process. So local planning policies aren't law, they're policies. They provide a guidance for decision making and discretion. So the applicant is right in saying that they are not an absolute, but what I would say is that the city has prepared these local planning policies with its best endeavours. They are consistent with state planning policy and strategy and our own local planning framework, and we feel that they provide us with solid ground to influence high quality built form development, which is sensitive to surrounding areas.
And on a similar vein, but slightly different, look, I don't want to either enter into a political area for staff, but this application, I think you've the staff report says is not conducive to orderly and proper planning. There is quite an argument being mounted by the applicant that in fact this is proper and orderly planning. So my question is if it had been a private application to rezone that area just north of or just to the west of 37 Wayland Road, would that have been considered proper and orderly planning? If that had been a private application rather than a government mandate to modify it?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. When talking about orderly and proper planning, we talk about the relationship that the planning scheme and controls have with the overall picture of development. So, taking a step back, the state government has made it clear that it seeks to have some density in and around train stations. And it has given the City of Subiaco an infill dwelling target as an inner city local government. In preparing our local planning strategy, the city considered where it would like to have areas of density, and it considered that Subiaco East, the town centre, and small nuanced areas around train stations were the best places to have density. It made a very clear approach in protecting character and heritage areas and delineated these on maps. Now, the argument of orderly and proper planning goes to the application itself, which is inconsistent with the city's local planning strategy. It seeks to impose medium density development in areas which are identified for character and heritage retention. So that goes to the crux of our argument to say that it is inconsistent with the local planning framework and our local planning strategy, which has been endorsed by the Planning Commission. Our scheme has been approved by the Minister, and it's inconsistent with how we would like density to be set out in our local area. So that's where we are going with the argument of orderly and proper planning. If this was to be supported, I would recommend that the local planning strategy would need to be modified to have a different housing approach and to encourage R40 and R60 development in these areas. That would be orderly and proper planning.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll take the opportunity to ask a question. The owners of 37 Wayland Road were the people on whose behalf the scheme amendment application has been lodged, haven't been shy about the fact that they've taken advice that their property has apparently taken a $200,000 hit in value as a result of the planning scheme. I don't think we've got any visibility of where that advice came from or whether it's correct or not, and without dismissing the very real heartache that such a economic loss would cause to the applicants. My question is an individual's property value a factor that we as a council can take into account when considering this scheme amendment?
Thank you, and through your presiding member, not for the scheme amendment, no. It's got to be based on planning considerations. Doesn't generally take into account property valuations.
Any other questions? Councillor De Vries.
Sorry. In the event that the application went to the WAPC and a Section 76 order was issued, has the city got the opportunity for presenting arguments? I mean, I presume a report would go with the application, which would contain the arguments, but that would sort of force us to advertise. Is that correct? Through you, Mayor.
I'm going to have to resort to the standing orders for that. Mr. Petrovski.
Thank you, and through your presiding member, I think the question was around would the city have an opportunity to provide its comment to the Minister for Planning should a representation be made? Yes, absolutely. That's the process, as I understand it, that the city would be provided an opportunity to comment, and we would seek to take that to elected members, but there would have to be significant justification for that. That's our recommendation.
Councillor Stroud.
Thank you, Mayor. And I believe that we do have an example of that in the pavilion site. That was a Section 76. I think it was one of the earliest when the legislation came in. So is that not true? It's probably not in your memory, but I believe we had a Section 76 on the pavilion site development, and that brought about, it was a change to our activity centre zone planning, taking it from 8 to 16 stories. And what we actually went through is a whole public consultation process, and you are given the opportunity, so I'm just confirming that, but we have actually been through that experience and lost. Yeah.
If there's a question in there, go ahead and answer it, Mr. Petrovski.
What I would say is, yes, many local governments have had that experience, but we're in a different time and age now. We've got a local planning scheme and strategy which is within the timeframes in the Planning and Development Act. It's younger than 5 years, which is generally the time frame in the Planning and Development Act. It's recently been signed off by both the Minister for Planning and the West Australian Planning Commission. So I would say that we have a very contemporary, if not one of the newest planning frameworks in Western Australia. So we would have a good argument in countering any Section 76s unless we act unreasonably, which I don't think we are.
I see that, I see that there's two questions at home, but I'll just ask one before we go to the Zoom attendees. Mr. Petrovski, a lot of work went into the scheme a couple of years ago, and in fact, one could say that the WAPC and the Minister pretty much told us how it was going to be. The final product is the scheme that Subiaco was left with. Is there any reason, in your professional opinion, to think that that they would now be supportive of an amendment to the scheme which they wholeheartedly approved a couple of years ago?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor, they would have to consider on planning merits. Now, the planning merits are, is the city providing infill? We've sought to do that. Is it in and around train stations? Yes. And is this additional infill in areas designed for character and heritage retention? Well, yes, it is. So given that there's already significant amounts of infill in and around this area, around train stations and other areas, we don't think there's a strong justification for the amendment to be supported.
We'll go left to right on the Zoom attendees, starting with Councillor Powell.
Thank you. And through you, Mayor. Look, just back to the application that's been made by the owners of the 37 Wayland. And it's the R codes and the point that's being made that additional height must create no adverse impact on the amenity of adjoining properties or the streetscape. Is it really being argued that this zoning won't create an impact on the amenity of the people in this Wayland Road property?
Thank you, and through you, Matt. Well, we don't have any proposals, so it's really difficult to not to consider any impacts or undue impacts on amenity without a proposal. If there is significant setbacks and potentially a two-storey development abutting the Wayland Road property, then potentially one may argue that there's no significant adverse impacts in terms of height, especially if it's all pushed towards a railway road or other areas.
You happy with that, Councillor Powell? Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, and I would expect Director to the Acting Director, if it's your choice. Councillor Stroud raised an interesting point about what's now called 1 Subiaco, was it at the time, and Section 76. And this is a question because I'm asking for the Acting Director's opinion. Councillor Stroud stated this, it wasn't the first 76, and basically whether it was or the first or the second, it's arguably irrelevant. But the way the question's put is after 75 fails, 76 takes place, the Minister accepts it, reads it, the applicant says I want 16 stories, sends it back to the council goes, what say you? We come back and go, well, sorry, 16 stories. I think I just said 17. 16 stories, and we come back and say, no, you go and just get lost. That's not happening. Well, again, this is still a question. So in this instance, would the Acting Director agree with me? What's actually taking place is by the council coming back and saying, well, you can shove your 16 wherever you like. We say 8, albeit that we've approved a 10-storey building across the road. That this goes beyond his previous comments about no, this wouldn't be accepted because for technical reasons, blah, blah, blah. My point would be, would the Acting Director accept this goes beyond technical arguments, it actually goes to emotional arguments. So, we tread on very thin ice when we look at these planning type applications because emotions do get involved. Is fair there? What does the Minister think, right? This is not a decision made by an automatron, okay? This decision's made on personalities, etc. So that's the first part of my question. I'd like an answer. Would the Acting Director accept that giving technical answers is actually not particularly, it's not inappropriate, okay? But you've got to look beyond those, okay? When we, in summation, when we said, sorry, Minister, 16, get lost, it's 8 or nothing, if we had come back and said 12, we would have looked reasonable. Halfway between
Councillor Powell, Burns, are you trying to draw parallels between the scheme amendment affecting the 1 Subiaco site and the scheme amendment we're considering now? Is that the reason we're talking about 16 stories?
Yeah, because we're talking about, okay, the fact that this is a question of our most senior currently acting planner that a moment ago stated.
Yep, so your question was, do you think it's appropriate to give us technical advice?
No.
Because it's an emotional, there's an emotional element to the decision.
will he accept, Chair, the question really is the acting director willing to accept it goes beyond, what the book says, it goes to what the individual thinks. And that's when we blow it every time, because we're thinking whatever, and we can do whatever, and it doesn't work that way.
Okay, well, I think you can answer the first part, but possibly not comment on the second part about whether or not we've blown it every other time previous to this.
I didn't say we blew it.
So look,
every other time.
Mr. Petrosky, I think the question is, do you accept that in addition to the technical elements, there's something else that a decision maker would take into account?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So, as someone providing advice from a planning perspective, any assessment undertaken would be based on the legislation. Now, a minister would need to take advice from the Western Australian Planning Commission or the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage on whether or not a local government has failed to adopt a local planning scheme in a case where an amendment ought to be adopted. So obviously there is a technical advice provided, and that can be provided both by the city and by the state government representatives, and then there's a decision to be made on that advice, and that is the minister's decision to be made. So there might be other considerations that the minister may have, but there is legislation behind that, and anything that's unreasonable, I would consider the city would to have an argument in that respect. I can't comment on what those considerations from the minister may be. All I know is that there is technical advice provided, and that is referenced in the Planning and Development Act.
Follow up, if I can, please.
Sure.
Member Mullen, I'll direct this to you, as the chair. If you want to push it on, by all means do, right? But I'd put it to you that technical answers made like the one we just heard, right? I'm not even going to classify them, okay? But these decisions, are made by individuals in powerful positions, and they can do it if they like. And I'd like to know your opinion, right, as to evaluating, you've had, if I remember correctly, you're the guy that couldn't get a cup of tea when he went and saw the minister, okay? But the minister got a cup of tea. So I'd suggest in a real world, you both got a cup of tea, but let's use that as a very minor example of people get punished. You were punished because you didn't get a cup of tea, okay? I'd suggest you can also get punished, okay, by not getting the planning outcome you want, no matter what the legislation says. And I'd wonder if that would be your opinion to agree with me.
I'm happy to speak to that, and I don't think it's something I could forward on for technical advice. Firstly, it was coffee, not tea, and there's things that we should probably talk about behind closed doors and not in chambers. But look, the way I see it, and I don't really know why my opinion on this would be particularly relevant, but the minister's making an administrative decision, and she would have an obligation to take into account only relevant considerations. Therefore, if she were to make a decision purportedly on planning grounds which wasn't supported by the technical advice of her department, then that would be a potentially invalid decision. But look, I think we're getting way ahead of ourselves. But that would be my view on the situation which you're anticipating.
Well, I am going to follow up with another question. You can make a fair point, okay? If we lived in a just world, okay? I'm going to ask you if you actually won, and this is one of two questions. One, do you actually think we live in a just world? Because I actually don't, right? But I'll let you formulate your own opinion. And secondly to that, you just stated that the minister, makes decisions made on documents presented by her, by, reams of technical staff, right? I'd put it to you that the minister, and whether it's the minister of this or the minister of anything, right? At the end of the day, the decisions that end up on their desks are the decisions they want to end up on their desk, okay? And maybe you don't want to answer that question. You can say you'd rather not because you don't know. But it's my opinion, and I'd suggest you might want to agree with me, right, that, we don't live in a just society, okay? And if you don't live in a just society, you better learn to readjust to it so that you actually end up getting what you like. And don't expect, as the acting director stated, that all things are just fair and that, everybody sticks to the legislation, everybody sticks to the rules. Because I live in a world, or the world I see every day of the week, right? Nobody lives to the rules, okay? People, pretty much, well, actually some people do, but a lot of people just do as they bloody well please. Anyway, you can either answer it or whatever, but I think I've made my point.
Thanks, Councillor Burns. It's not that I couldn't answer it, but anything I say is not going to help the decision-making process. So I'm going to move on to Councillor Powell because I see that he's got a question.
Fair enough.
Thank you. One of the other points about this is whether it is a simple or a complex amendment. I think the city is arguing that it's complex. The applicant is arguing that it's simple. What I'd like to know is how that's going to be decided, on what basis that is decided, and what flows on from whichever decision it is, whether it is simple or complex. What would flow on from that?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So the local planning schemes regulations provide three classes of amendments: complex, basic, and standard. A basic amendment is where there's really minor things that don't have any land use implications or changes, updating legislation, references, errors, so forth. A standard amendment is an amendment which is consistent with a local planning strategy endorsed by the Planning Commission. And a complex amendment, and I'm summarising here, a complex amendment would be one that's inconsistent with the local planning strategy endorsed by the WAPC. So as part of the regulations, the local government needs to classify what it thinks the amendment is. Given that it's inconsistent with our local planning strategy, we recommend that Council consider it a complex amendment. We have to do that in any event. Because our recommendation is that the amendment not be adopted and go any further, it may be a moot point because it may not go any further than that. It's interesting that the way that the legislation is created, it does provide a gatekeeper for the Planning Commission to consider whether an amendment is complex or standard, but that will only, in my understanding, be enlivened if the amendment is progressed to advertising, because there are slightly different processes.
So just a little bit more on that. If the amendment is not supported by the council, and what happens? Is the applicant still entitled to go to the minister, and then is the argument about whether it's a simple or a complex amendment? Is that sort of what's going to determine it, or, as you say, a basic or a complex?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So if Council adopts the officer recommendation not to proceed with the amendment, it goes to the Planning Commission and that's it. The Planning Development Act obviously has Section 76 provisions, which we've talked about, which would then start the amendment process. Now, if that is then started in the future, then there will be consideration and direction by the Minister or the Planning Commission on the nature of the amendment, whether it's standard or complex, but it's probably not something that we need to get into now.
Looks like there's no further questions at home. Councillor Hammersley.
Yeah, thank you. I think you have told us this before, but can you just remind me, the R100, which is set, did the City of Subiaco propose that zoning, or was that one of the ones that the Minister required? And if so, what did we propose?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. It was initially considered an appropriate place for density by the city and recommended by council that that go to the R100. That then went to further modification, further advertising, and council's last resolution was that that R100 be retained to its original density under TPS4, which I'm going to assume was R15 with the rest of the block.
So just to be clear, when Subiaco sent back its final proposal to the minister, it was R15, and then it was sent back with an instruction that it be R100. Is that correct?
That's correct, thank you.
Thanks. And also, having read the report of the applicant, I did notice that, I actually didn't print the page, but I think there was a page where there was some modelling done, and it looked to me as if it suggested that each of the lots in that R100 area would be consolidated and there'd be one big development on that site. And I think they were trying to illustrate how that might impact on them. I'm not sure that that's particularly relevant. You could tell me whether it is or isn't. The other thing is, it's a bit shadowy on here, but am I right? Is there 5 lots in that R100, and do we know if any of them have been consolidated yet?
Thank you, and through presiding member, I understand the model that they chose was a replication of 97 Emmons Street, which was a DA previously considered. In terms of the number of lots in the R100, it looks to be 5 lots.
Councillor Kosovich. Well, I've asked Councillor Kosovich to ask his question.
Hammersley did ask if any of them had been consolidated.
Councillor Hammersley just said her question's finished. Was there anything further, Councillor Hammersley?
Thank you, and through presiding member, they're all in separate ownership.
Councillor Kosovich.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you, just looking at page 48 under financial, and I'll read that, any cost incurred by the city in the preparation or implementation of the proposed amendment will be recouped from the landowner requesting the amendment in accordance with the planning and development regulations. And then further down, there are a broad range of customer services provided to the community which aren't captured by the planning assessment fees. In broad terms, what sort of fees are we looking at? And is the landowner aware of those?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, yes, we've provided the process providing this scheme amendment report with an estimate of fees, and I would say that they'd likely be around $8,000 to $10,000. I would give an officer time. Now that would be for an amendment proceeding, so that is an amendment which would go to public advertising and such. I'll have to get more detail for the OCM next week on what the estimated costs are for the landowners preparing the amendment at this current time, because it depends on the hours allocation of all staff members on that project.
Thank you.
No further questions? Okay, I think we're finished with C3. On to C4, proposed urban strategic planning projects. Any questions on that item? Okay, doesn't look like there is. Item C5, heritage grant applications. Any questions? Item C6, endorsement of the draft waste local law. Councillor De Vries.
Through you, Mayor McMullen. Just a quick question regarding the item 26 or clause 2.7e. I'm just curious to know whether we're going to have inspectors going out checking that things have been disinfected and cleaned and deodorised. I mean, it is obviously an issue when things are left and become disgusting and so on, but a $300 fine for what might be a sort of something that people just generally forget to do or maybe can't do because it's physically difficult. It just seems a bit rough. And also, could we offer any support to people who can't do it themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McMullen. No, we won't have inspectors going around. The only time we would implement that would be if it was reported as a nuisance, like a health nuisance. So, but initially we would take a consultative approach.
No other questions from councillors? Councillor Stroud.
I've got a question because there has been an email asking, making a few points, which is fair enough, but is it not true that contaminated waste goes straight to landfill?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McMullen. Yeah, that would be correct.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor.
Sorry, Councillor Stroud. The CEO's offering some advice on the topic. He's a man of many talents.
Just add, it depends. So there are ways in which certain waste is sorted as well. So particularly some of the FOGO that's coming through, there is sorting that occurs. And then in future, there is also waste to energy once that comes on board. So that would be where the residual would go, either landfill or predominantly in the future waste to energy.
Yes, I'm aware of that. But
Sorry, Councillor Stroud, I accidentally turned you off, so I'm going to press my button and you can go again.
Under our present system where we don't have the waste to energy alternative and we are not practicing FOGO, that contaminated waste does go straight to landfill. Is that correct?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McMullen. Yeah, that would be correct at this point in time, yeah.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. The next question is that the WMRC tagging system is actually a service provided to Subiaco and to all member councils. And the point of it is an education system. There's no penalty attached to it. It's purely education so people can understand, you know, to sort their waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor McMullen. Yeah, that's correct. It's designed to try and help people understand and encourage better waste behaviours and prevent contamination, therefore saving money because we don't go straight to landfill.
And if I could, through the chair, it's been designed across many local governments, started many years ago, to be honest, particularly the first efforts were when we went to 2 bins. And the yellow top bin, there was audits that were done and a range of things. So the WMRC is doing something that's very similar across many local governments to try and educate. Now that we're going to 3 bins, makes it a little bit more challenging.
Councillor Kosbich.
Thank you, Mayor. And just on the subject of contaminated waste, that's a fairly broad term. Are there various categories of contaminated waste, and what can go to landfill and what can't, please?
Thank you, through you, Mayor McMullen. Yeah, there are various different types of contaminated waste. For instance, household hazardous waste, say paint, chemicals, wouldn't go direct to landfill, but the WMRC does provide a facility for residents to be able to recycle that sort of material. When it comes to your recycle bin, obviously if we find household waste in your recycle bin, then that's deemed contaminated. And moving on to when we eventually go to FOGO, it would be the same when we find plastics or various types of household waste that's not organic and can't be turned into organic matter, then yes, that would be deemed contaminated.
Perhaps if I could add, I suppose when we're using the term contaminated, not in the sense of contaminated sites type, it's in relation to the sorting, because ideally you want sorting to occur at source, and so usually there's education process through evaluating what's within the bin to say should it be in that bin. Classic examples, pizza boxes should not be in recycling. So that's not a contaminated material, but it's contaminated for the yellow top bin, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Councillor De Vries.
Yeah, I'm sure that it's going to be a great success when we educate our community, but I think my emails were just simply pointing out that significant change takes time, and people aren't naturally drawn to, wanting to do things that they haven't done before. So I think we know, in Zurich apparently you're only allowed like a bin the size of a little tiny bin for your waste, and all sorts of changes have taken place over a number of years. So I anticipate that will be the case. So it's a question regarding the education program, and I think my point is a valid one, that we can't just put a letter in a mailbox and expect that everybody's going to have read it, or put an advertisement in the paper and everyone's read it. I think it's really important that we tackle the community, a bit like recently elected member Tatangni has done, where he's door-knocked communities when there's been lack of understanding about certain issues to do with policing. And I think this is an approach which I would really be interested in knowing whether we're going to take a sort of more hands-on personal approach when we educate people about waste, because it is, as Councillor Strata has pointed out, a very, very important issue, but one that we should bring to the community in a way that I'm interested to know what you've got to say about it, actually, rather than me going on. Sorry.
Thank you to you, Member Mullen. Yeah, look, the intention is that initially in the first 3 to 6 months we're going to be taking an educational approach to the waste local law. And helping people and assisting people to understand what is contamination, what's not, and how to avoid it, and best practice. So that's the intention behind it. Certainly not to just put a letter in a mailbox and tell them they owe us $500. That's certainly not the intention of the waste local law. But it is definitely designed to try and assist us manage our waste services more effectively and encourage better waste behaviours in our community.
Perhaps if I could jump in as well, if that's okay. We're fortunate because we've also got something coming as well. So the WMRC, it's a big part of their job. I think they're recently award-winning, if I understand, their communications team. So we've also got that coming in terms of the implementation of FOGO. So, but WMRC do a really great job in that education as well. So our work will sort of go hand in glove with that, in terms of this is the tool, but ultimately most of the work the WMRC is around, not the hammer, it's about educating and encouraging.
Councillor Hammersley.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we detect is that there is some anxiety about the idea of fining people over their rubbish bins. And I think it is a valid question and a valid issue. So perhaps what might help us is to hear why would we have that legislation in place, presumably as a last resort, and what sort of recalcitrants do we anticipate that would need something like that to be on the books so that the staff are properly empowered? Like, why do we need it? Would be helpful, I think.
Thank you, through you, Mayor McMullen. Ultimately, the waste local law is really only for that very small percentage of residents or people who choose to do the wrong thing, and to try and help educate them. And ultimately, we don't want to fine people, but it could potentially get to that point where we do need to have some sort of legislation where we can hold people accountable if they choose or continue to not do the right thing. What we anticipate is that majority of the community do want to do the right thing, and they want to see good things happen and good change, so yeah, the main reason behind it is just to assist us and enable us to be able to manage that small percentage that choose not to do the right thing.
Councillor Hammersley.
Thank you, that's helpful. And so then the second question is, perhaps this is really more around where the power lies. We can create the power for the city to have, perhaps it may not, the council may decide that it's just a step too far, but if we did, then the next question is, how is it going to be exercised and how does the council feel comfortable? Maybe there needs to be a written policy or some sort of agreement that it would not be used without council reference, because it's a really new thing. I mean, this is, I can't imagine I've ever heard of, parking fines, we've lived with them for all our lives, but rubbish bin fines, not so much. I've never heard of it. So I'm just wondering, rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, whether we need to think a little bit more about what the policy is about how this is, where the lines are, so that we as a council don't end up getting it in the neck from our constituents saying, well, what the heck are you jokers doing? So maybe you can address that question.
Yeah, if I could, through the chair. Look, I'd be surprised if there'd be one fine. That would be the way I'd consider it. And I think when the first one comes up, which may be in many years' time, then it would be a case of providing advice to the elected members as to how it transcribed. I don't think we probably need a policy in that regard, because we'll probably be notifying you the first time we do it. And then you've got some sort of test case to say, well, maybe we should have a policy. But I think it's going to be unlikely. So in that regard, I don't believe you'd probably need to provide any caveats at this stage or shape how we implement that, because I think it'd be unlikely.
Councillor Kosovich.
Just to follow up on that, I think the logic of where we're going here is education and then about changing behaviours as opposed before we go to a punitive response. So, and I think that's a sensible way, but as that message needs to get out there to our community too. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Mayor McMullen, if I could just chip in. The idea of the penalties as well is to give an incentive and to let the community know that there may be some penalties if they were to do the wrong thing. So it's just that knowledge within the community to make them think twice, I suppose, in relation to what they put in their respective bins. And following what Colin said, that we'd be looking at discretion through this process. So we're not just going to dive in and start handing out penalties through the process. It's an education process. It's making the community aware how serious the city is in relation to waste, and hopefully inform the community through our own communication channels and also our partnership with the WMRC. So it is a truly education process to make the community aware that we are serious about waste within the community and how we deal with it. Thank you.
Councillor White.
Hi, thank you. Look, I agree with the recommendation and everything. I'm in support of this, but hearing everybody, I also am very strongly in support of what everyone else is saying, which I think is we need a strong education element, awareness raising element to this. So I guess my question is it not possible that we add that to the recommendation that we consider next week, that there is a very strident public awareness campaign introduced as this is taken forward? Thank you.
That might actually be a question that Mr. Millard's best placed to answer, because my observation is that we're being asked to approve a waste local law, whereas we're straying into territory about some associated communications. Did you have any thoughts on that, Director?
Through you, Mayor McMullen, I don't see an issue with adding an amendment onto the recommendation that once the waste local law is gazetted, that the city implements a communication process and plan, which we are going to do anyway. So I wouldn't see an issue in regards to that.
Just to confirm, is that something that will be handled administratively, or do you need a council direction to get that ball rolling? Okay, the CEO is going to answer that, and then we'll see if you can supplement his comments.
Yeah, I think it's probably unnecessary, because we can provide some information in general, but I think where the education is best placed is in, the preventative side, the sort of elements that the WMRC are already doing, which is about positive sort of reinforcement of people doing the right thing, rather than a lot of message about how you might be fined. So I think we just need to be careful about it's important people know that it's there, but it's more about, I think, the work we do to educate people in the way in which they separate at source and those types of elements, rather than a fine that is unlikely to probably ever occur.
Yeah, if I could.
Mr. Millard.
Yes, we'll be going through that communication process anyway from an administration point of view. But the way we would be pitching it is about the local law and the reasons for the local law, and we wouldn't be pitching the penalty process about it. So it'll be mainly on the education and doing the right thing.
Councillor Stroud.
It's interesting because we have so many local laws that have fines attached to them and no one would even realise. But isn't it true that now, because we are no longer dumping everything into landfill and wanting to poison our soils, that this is all about managing waste wisely. The other change here is that I believe, isn't it true that there's actually a strong safety component to this, because, and we are in effect trying to protect our public as well as our landfill and everybody else that's dealing with waste. Because, for example, batteries that we seemingly harmlessly throw into a waste bin that should not be thrown into a waste bin can actually set a fire truck alight, and has done so. We've got examples of that. And isn't it true that in not thinking twice about throwing paint or chemicals into our waste bin could equally cause fire or contaminate? And so once again, perhaps in our education, we really have to bring out this safety component, far more important than, the basketball hoops that also attract fines, but a good example of where we've actually never had to apply one either. Yeah, thank you.
We'll take that nodding as agreement. Any other councillors with questions? Okay, no one at home, no one in the chambers. Let's move on to C7, the E.H. Parker Library External Restoration Project. I note there's been a number of queries by email, mainly from Councillor Stroud, who's been busy over the weekend, and I think most of those have been answered, but I'll be looking for further questions. Councillor Stroud, is that yes, or further questions? Okay, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'm happy to kick this off, and we've definitely had some robust discussions today, and I thank you for all that. I'd like to refer staff just to page 68, where in their report they're actually suggesting that the works to the rear car park that were initially proposed have been removed from the scope of work. But if I can then refer them to the cost estimates in the attachment, I believe that that scope is still actually in the pricing. And where it is I think on page 4, under the heading about 2/3 down the page, roads, footpaths and paved areas. Make good to bitumen where demolished for new scope, remove existing bitumen and so on. I believe, and allowance for new line marking to car parks. So is it true that we actually haven't removed that scope of works from our estimate of quotes? Thank you.
The CEO can answer that.
Unless you wanted to, Joel, but I think you're referring to the indicative cost estimates. That was done at a point in time. That was prepared for the elected members during the councillor workshop, and so it's just formed part of that work. We haven't got that estimate because it, so how, assuming council decide to proceed with this, then there would be a detailed tender proposal that would go out for tenders to be received back, and that would not be included in that. So we haven't updated that indicative cost estimate because that was just for a point in time. I think that's right, Joel. Yeah.
I'd just like to point out there are other costs associated to that, splattered through, and I appreciate this was done in time. However, as a council, we've been asked to approve a 1.5 million spend that may not be 1.5, and I'm reluctant to, approve a spend. I'd like it to be more accurate. So is it possible that staff could, before next week, actually re-look at this indicative cost estimate and make some adjustments? Because there are, I'll lead on to my next question, so just hold on to that, because also from a discussion today, it was agreed that it is possible that our operations team could do a lot of the demolition landscaping. And if they've got the time and resources, now that potentially could also take quite a lot of costs out of this indicative spend, which once again are splattered through. There's some lump sums, but it is splattered through. And these costs make a difference because we're adding a contingency cost to them and rounding off numbers and whatever. And we could be talking, at the end of the day, we could be talking about a 1.2 million instead of a 1.5 million spend. And to me, that makes a difference in my consideration of going ahead and approving this. Thank you for your comment. Thank you.
CEO, could you cause staff to revise the report before next week, and would you?
If I can, I'll just probably take you through the process first, and then that would help guide the elected members. So the QS's reports are quite often done at a particular time to try and get an estimate as to what the likely budget is. And the greater the knowledge, usually the less the contingency that you would place on establishing that budget. Having said that, at the moment we're in quite an escalation of costs and materials, and so we actually won't know what this will cost until we go to tender and receive the tenders back. And at that point in time, they will those that make submissions to the tender will determine, they will describe materials and all sorts of things that they would contain within that tender. It is up to council to decide whether to proceed with that tender at that point. So it could cost $1 million, it could cost $1.5 million, or somewhere in between. And that would be the point in council's absolute discretion to decide to proceed or not to proceed. If council decide not to proceed, so a recent example of that, where council decided not to proceed, or was on some demolition works on the old depot site. Under the Local Government Act, you've then got up to 6 months to negotiate with parties as to a price. So when you go to tender, it's an absolute discretion as to whether you proceed or not. So what council are not determining next week is to decide to proceed with a tenderer. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is there's not a lot of utility in updating those numbers. We could do that, but it could come out at a much higher amount. It may well do, but it would take time and resources. So what I'm suggesting is it's probably not much benefit, because by the time you prepare your scope for tender and go out to tender, that's really the time when you know what the value of the works are. And within that, the way in which we would undertake the tender would enable us to value manage if the costs blew out too much. So hopefully that explains. I suppose what I'm saying is I don't believe elected members need an updated schedule to determine whether or not we should proceed with this project, because ultimately that will be at the time when we're accepting the tender or not. So what this report is try and say, let's establish the budget and let's proceed with this project and do all the documentation to go out to tender. And then when you get that back, you'll know what the price is going to be, and then you can decide whether you wish to proceed on that basis or not. Is there anything else, Joel, that you think I should add or no? So hopefully that answers your question.
I have to think about that. Thank you. Because the next question, maybe you'll give the same answer, but there was justification in this report that, and if I understood it right, that it was better to pitch at this higher amount because to come back to because otherwise they'd have to come back to council and ask for more money. But why is that a problem? Because it's not an arduous process to come back to council. We can call a special council meeting in 30 minutes. These days with Zoom, we can all come together pretty quickly. And I suppose I'm coming from is just, I'm reluctant to okay more money that is needed when that sum is already included all the contingencies of where we've added 15% and 7.5% and so on. We've added that onto it to hopefully cover for these costs. And bearing in mind, these estimates are, I would have thought, done in light of the costs already in what has been a huge change of costs in industry. To me it's a little bit, we're not quite signing off on an open checkbook, but I'm uncomfortable about signing off on, a 1.5 when it might really could just be $1 million project. But whether it gives the wrong direction to staff, oh well, they've actually got $1.5 million to spend. Let's go. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. If you wouldn't mind commenting, thank you.
If I could, through the chair. So the mechanics of budget adoption is obviously we're adopting a budget, but this project doesn't specifically go into the calculation in terms of a rate increase or decrease or that, because we have set aside funds in the reserve, okay? So this would be a reserve funded project, all right? So it's from previous rates collection, etc., and all the other income streams that we have. So it's more a case of the simplistic approach is we think this should cover it, and therefore we don't need to adjust budgets in the future. But you're right, every month that we meet, we could make budget adjustments if we wish, or rather council can. That's their power to do so. You don't need to call a special council meeting, you just do it every month at a council meeting. We tend to do it 3 times a year at Subiaco, others do it more often. So budget adjustments can occur. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that the allocation of the budget or the suggestion of what the budget should be in this report, and then the adoption of the budget in no way reflects what the price may be in that the competitive tension happens through the tender process, and that will determine if at that point in time it's appropriate. And what the elected members, or council rather, will decide at that point in time is that appropriate value? Because there would be a choice to say, well, actually, we could hold off on this and do this another time, not obviously noting that there are water ingress and other issues in terms of the way in which we've got those, the trees, etc., and the shrubs around it, which was not how it was originally designed. But we will really only know that. So I suppose if I could hopefully alleviate your fears, the fact that we adopt a budget of that does not mean that should influence what the people that are likely to tender will tender. They will do so on the basis of the works and their understanding of the scope of the work, and they will do so hoping to win it, which will incorporate a factor of price, even though price is not everything, because you're trying to achieve value for money through a tender process. So that's the sort of competitive tensions at that point in time that once we got those back, if council determined to proceed, it may need to add additional budget, or it may be able to say, oh, actually, we can reduce the budget. So I suppose hopefully I can alleviate your fears and say it's not, and if, as Joel and I've discussed with you today, if we deal with some matters through separable portions, it sort of gives an opportunity as well at that time to receive those value packages back, and council could say, actually, we don't wish to proceed with this element. Hopefully there's enough, I think, in this report that should not necessarily concern you in relation to what the budget is, because when we get the tenders back is what we'll know the price of the works are, and there's opportunities to determine whether you wish to proceed with all of it or some of it you may scale back. And likewise, there will be further work to work out, is it more appropriate that our staff do particular elements, or is it, and that comes to scheduling, who we have available and all those other matters, and the price that would cost, because that still is staff time and effort, but we would do that analysis and whether it's appropriate to delete that from the contract. I suspect, without knowing, actually it probably wouldn't make too much difference, is just my guess, but I could be completely wrong in that regard, but we should do the analysis. I hope I've answered the question.
And in really agreeing with what you're saying, we do have precedents of where monies have been set aside in the budget and we haven't spent it all, and suddenly we have a budget surplus because, yeah. So that's good. That just shows good financial handling. And your point of saying this is coming out of the reserves means this is not affecting our analysis of our rates in terms of what we're going to set our rates at for the future budget. Is that correct?
Yeah, if I can through the chair, yes and no. I hate to do this, but predominantly it doesn't contain that. But ultimately, you as elected members and we as staff advise about the long-term financial plan that includes how much you recharge your reserves with, etc. So I suppose it does all come in the mix in terms of if you were to spend too much from your reserves and then you had an asset gap, then how you would deal with that. So it sort of plays into the mix, but I suppose not directly in an annual sense, if that makes sense.
Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for your comments, CEO. Look, I fall closer to Councillor Stroud's comments, and in accepting the CEO's comments about we need to get further down and the numbers will sharpen up. But even looking on physical page 67, not 69 of what would be the PDF, it's things like tiered garden beds, including shrubberies and selected trees. Well, I'd just particularly on that one item as an example, I'd like a little more information, because you know, one of the things about this building from day one, and my question was, I'd like more information. Now I'm saying why, Chair, is besides probably the three largest of the trees, I'd like to see everything gone and it taken back to what it was meant to be. But if that's the case, there's nothing in there about, and I don't know because of the external, for want of a better word, texture of the outside of the building. You know, are we intending? I don't think you can spray it down without it falling apart. Are we repainting the outside of the building, or we're just going to leave it as it is and then just light it up? There's a question there to be answered. I also am not. You can answer those if you like, CEO, if you want to before I move on.
Thanks, Councillor Burns. I'm advised that the Manager Commercial Services and Property is probably better placed to answer those particular questions.
Okay.
Thank you for the questions. Through you, Mayor McMullen, I believe the answers to those questions are probably contained in the attachments to the report. So attachment 2 contains the final landscaping concept design. And I'm not sure if you've had the chance to look at those attachments, Councillor Burns, but attachment 2 articulates which trees are to be retained.
Joel, could you just tell me on what page? Because I've got it in front of me.
So I'm looking at the attachments, and it's page 185 of the PDF document is the landscaping plan. And that shows which trees are to be retained, and by implication, which trees need to be removed in order to undertake the works. And in terms of your second question about the treatment of the facade, that's probably best answered in the scope of work that was prepared by the architect. Off the top of my head, that's attachment 1 to the report, and that begins on page, if you bear with me, that begins on page 166 of the attachments. And so essentially what they're proposing is to replace some of the damaged panels that have cracks in them or graffiti and things like that, and to apply, I believe it's an acid wash or something of that nature in order to clean the panels. We can get some more details on that if you require, but I think if you have the chance to look at those attachments, they should answer some of those questions in a bit more detail.
I'm sorry, I had seen the attachments. I didn't realise it went into a second section. So I apologise, I missed that. Okay, look, so that's fine enough, and I'll go further through it before the meeting. But moving on, through you, Chair, with further questions, I also, and I do understand CEO's points about we have to, these are guesstimated numbers, but I really, not guesstimated, I apologise for the word, but if you look at the quantity surveyors work at PDF page 172, so you've got restoration work, including landscaping, design contingency, but then, just dropping in professional fees at 150, lighting anywhere between 50 and 150, contingency 0 to 200,000. It's a little further away from guesswork than I'd like it. So I'll move backwards to what you said before about to getting down to more the nitty-gritty of numbers. And then I was deciding not to go ahead. My question through the chair, if the chair decides that it is for the CEO to answer, what does that cost? What do you mean? To get down to the very root of quotes and everything else, and then just decide, sorry, we're not doing it. What's that number?
Yeah, CEO.
John may be able to answer this a little bit better, but I suppose what you need to do when bring these projects forward is you have a particular level of certainty at the time in order to assist council as to the magnitude of what is likely, and that's what we're trying to achieve here. And if council say yes, this is a worthy project, particularly because it deals with shoring up the foundations and solving some of the roof issues in the main, and also restoring, I suppose, the building to its former glory, that gives sufficient. We have enough information then to proceed and start doing the work, which is a combination of staff time and experts to shore up the scope and legals and a whole range of other things. And Joel may well be able to assist us on that. But the idea that I would assume that council would be of the view that this work should be done at some point in time. So it's work that would not be lost, even if council determined not to proceed or reject all tenders, and then we'd be in a position whereby we could negotiate for the next 6 months to achieve a particular outcome, perhaps to deal with certain matters rather than others. So I suppose I'll hand over to the manager if he wishes to try and give an estimate in terms of the likely cost to be able to get to that point where we issue a tender for those that wish to submit prices back to us.
Thanks, Colin. It's a great question, Councillor Burns. Through the chair, something that I'm really mindful of with projects is, and especially where there's a bit of complexity and some quite material funds involved, is that we don't go off and do a lot of work and spend a lot of money on consultants to bring something back to council which has that level of granular detail and which has costed sort of plus minus 15-20%, and having spent $100,000 on professional fees, council says actually this project isn't a priority for us at this time, and that scenario for me would be suboptimal in the sense that we've spent a lot of time and money on a project that isn't a project that council decides to proceed with. So normally what we try and do is enough work to give council the information they need to make an informed decision. So in this case, we got a heritage architect on board. We asked them to prepare a scope, and we obtained a QS estimate of that scope. The next stage of the project, so if council decides to proceed, what we would do is engage various different sub-consultants. So we'd look to engage a hydraulic engineer, mechanical engineer, roof safety consultant, lighting designer, etc. And they would prepare a set of contract documents, which you might call the document bundle that goes to tender. We could get another QS on that, which would really firm up the price. But I would expect to pay approximately $100,000 or in the order of for professional fees in order to produce that more detailed bundle of documents. So if that's the level of detail that council requires to make a decision, there's a fair bit more work and expense involved, and the risk is that we do that work and the project doesn't proceed. So we try and strike the right balance, and sometimes we need to add a little bit more, but in this case we feel that we've presented some pretty detailed information in order to obtain a decision, and if council so decides to take us to the next stage of the project.
All right, thank you, Joel. Look, look, this isn't a question, but just so you understand my position, right?
Councillor Burns, it does worry me when you preface your comment with something like that. Maybe see if you can work it into a question, because that's the purpose of the briefing.
David, I was just going to say it's my favourite building. That's Okay, so I wasn't going far. But I do get concerned, Joel, when anybody that throws numbers at me, and I shouldn't say throw, that sounds weird to you, but when I hear things like, and that's why I'd like it is a question, I think it'd be $100,000 of consultancy fees, right? Well, to me, well, then why not 200,000? Why not 300,000? Okay. I mean, if you said, I'd rather you made it up and just said, I think it's going to be $85,500 worth of consultancy fees, and I'd probably believe you. But these rounded out numbers, to me, I need more faith. You know what I mean? I want the job done properly, and I want more faith in. And when everything just rounds out...
Councillor Burns, the CEO's wanting to volunteer some clarifications, so now would probably be a good time to do that.
Sure.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add further to sort of round out the conversation about how much we do beforehand, how much we do once council say this is a worthy project or not. The work that Joel just described in terms of up to 100,000, or it could be thereabouts or more, is because of the nature of the project. There are detailed information that would be required for a tenderer to be able to provide a reasonable tender and to know the exact scope of the work. Over the 20 years in local government, quite often the question that I'm asked the most is, why is it there's such a huge differential in the price that's come in from this tenderer to this tenderer? And generally it's when they haven't understood the scope of the work and what the likely costs associated with that are. So it is really important that we do have the experts to provide that guidance on that documentation so that it is a level playing field for those that wish to submit a tender, and so they clearly understand the work. What you don't want is to go with the lowest tenderer that really did not understand the scope of work, and then they're likely to do a suboptimal job because they didn't understand it, and likely to come back for to try and say, well, we need to make adjustments to this tender because we really didn't understand it. So it is an assessment, a professional assessment that us officers need to do to say, what is the right level of documentation that we need? And the more you move into heritage and other particular issues, the more there is opportunity where you need to have contingency because matters can occur. And the way in which that also transpires is if something is not known and then it becomes known during the process, like for example, if you were to remove something and then something was hidden, then actually you would be required, if that needed to be made good, then it would need to be made good and you would need to pay for that to be made good because it was unknown at the time. So the idea is have sufficient documentation from experts that give those that wish to submit a tender the best information for them to put in the best price that will last for the, in terms of whole of life costing, that will do the best work for that particular asset, that sustain that asset for the longest period of time. So that's essentially why managers giving you that information into what the likely cost is, because we've sought feedback and we've received feedback that those experts are likely to cost in that order.
Then thank you, Colin. Could I ask this question through the chair? How much have we spent today? You know, with the architects and anybody other consultants you've spoken to come up. You know, to even come up with these numbers. What's the extent of the checks we've written to now?
Mr. Guest, can you answer that?
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair. Yeah, look, it's obviously significantly less than that. I'd need to take the question on notice, but I'd suspect it would be less than $20,000. I can take that on notice and get back to you. But just to give you some comfort in terms of the numbers, I think there was an implication that, you know, we'd almost come up with these numbers and what's the logic behind them. Just to give you some comfort around that. On page 72 of the agenda, I think it's page 70 of the document itself. We set out the breakdown for the numbers. So we do have a QS assessment. Typically, professional fees are in the order of 10 to 15% of the value of a project, and that's reasonably standard and a well-known position. But in terms of the contingency and the other numbers that we have there, we've taken advice from our architect. So we do have a very experienced heritage architect on board who has a lot of experience with old buildings and complex buildings. And I'm really glad to hear that you love this building. And so these aren't numbers that I've dreamt up. These are numbers that have been...
Joel, I haven't suggested that. You know, man. I think where you're missing my point, and I'm not trying to enter a debate here, Mayor McMullen, right? I think where you're missing my point is that I arguably think this is far more important than where we're at right now as to moving forward.
Councillor Burns, I understood the question was how much have we spent on consultant fees to date, which Mr Guest is going to take on notice.
Well, yeah, I know, but and I'm okay. Well, then my question's this, through you, Mr Mayor. I'm not very. I'd hope you'd accept my disappointment. You can tell me if you don't, and that's my question, right? When somebody says, I think it's about anything. I don't like anybody that gives me an answer. I think it's about, okay? I mean, this is, you know, I'm on page 72.
Okay, well, look, I think the staff have pretty clearly explained why it is that they've proposed a range of dollar figures and how they've formed their view on that. I think for us as councillors, if we're not happy with that, then we put pen to paper on an amendment for next week. But I don't think we should be saying we're not happy with the answers that we're getting back, because I'm hearing the same answers as you and I'm pretty satisfied with them.
Well, okay, but thank you very much. But and albeit, you know, I mean, you're the mayor, and I agree with that. But I have an equal right to satisfaction as you do, as far as, you know, I mean, your right to satisfaction is no greater than mine. I'm sorry, or anybody else sitting.
Okay, well, look, have a think about an amendment and see what kind of support there might be for that. In the meantime, I think we'll go to Councillor Powell, who's been patiently waiting with a question.
I'm happy with that.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. Away from the world of high finance to something quite different. Is it the plan to institute to have steps at the entrance to the library? And if so, why?
Mr Guest.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. Through the chair, I believe that Silver Goldberg, the architect for the building, had in their original drawings steps. And we're not sure why they didn't proceed with steps. Clearly there's a ramp there now, but our architect felt strongly that steps created a particular statement and feeling and were appropriate with a building of that nature. So that's really come from the architect, the heritage architect, and I did circulate their reasons for that earlier today. So that may assist if you haven't already seen that, but it really has come from the architect, and they feel quite strongly that steps would be appropriate.
To the best of my knowledge, there never have been steps. They may have been in the original plan, but they were never built. So as an aesthetic point, perhaps, you know, sort of, as you say, perhaps the architect has an argument, but I'm not sure that, you know, sort of putting steps there, which on a building that's never had them, is perhaps the right way to go, because I think that installing steps just for an aesthetic thing brings its own problems in regard to safety and access and other issues, especially disability access. So could you just comment on that, please?
So just before
Oh, yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Thanks, Councillor Powell. I'll just jump in and acknowledge that Councillor White has sent round a message saying that he has to sign out from the meeting or the briefing. So thanks for joining us, Councillor, as long as you're able to, and we'll talk next week, I assume.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone. I'm sorry. My apologies. Thank you.
Hi, Simon.
Okay, over to you, Mr. Guest, for an answer. CEO, yep.
If I could answer first. Look, we've had quite a bit of conversation, and we did it on the night as well. And so that's the architect's recommendation. One way that we can deal with it is by including that as a separable portion. So that would be something, as I described earlier, around value management, but also judgment. So the elected members or council may decide that actually, no, we don't wish to proceed with that, even though that's the advice from the architect. So so it's just one of those things that we've got advice from somebody that's passionate about this building and is, an expert. I'm an accountant, and so, I don't think it's of value, but, I've been called a Philistine before, but maybe that's a bit unkind to Philistines. So, I think council and the elected members collectively would form a judgment as to whether or not that was appropriate. But what the architects is saying is that actually getting back to that original concept and idea, the other part of it was making sure that, the brick wall at the bottom was painted in a really dark sort of chocolate brown colour, so it looked like the building was floating. So he's brought all that back to us, which I think is great in understanding. But ultimately, with that particular part, because it was never implemented, it would be up to council, I suppose, to determine whether or not they, once those tenders come back, whether or not they think actually that separable portion's worth doing or not.
If I can just add through the chair, the proposal still does include a ramp. So it's not removing the ramp and replacing it with stairs. There would still be a ramp off to the side, and the stairs would be an addition. But I really think Colin's suggestion is a good one, that when we go to market, we can ask the contractor to quote option 1, which would be a ramp, and option 2, which would be stairs and a ramp. And when it comes to council to award the tender, you could also make a decision if you wanted to about whether to go with the stair option or not the stair option.
So just to clarify that, so any decision we may make next week will not necessarily affect whether they're going to be stairs or not at the entrance.
Through the chair, if the stairs is something that that is a little bit contentious, then we would bring that back to council when the tender comes back to council. So yes, there will be another opportunity to consider that.
Councillor Jennings.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a question about the landscaping and the retaining existing trees, and that is in the attachments as referred to as the manager of, or Mr. Guest referred to. That's on page, PDF page 185 in the attachments. The tree in the, what is that, the southeast corner of the library, it says it's to be a new tree species. And my understanding from the workshop that we had with the architect, and I think I asked the direct question, can that tree that's there in that existing tree in that southeast corner, can that be retained? And the answer, if I recall correctly, was it can be retained, but this plan is now showing, apparently, although I might be misinterpreting or not reading it correctly, we've got a new tree there. So can you clarify that, please? And if the tree is to, when was the decision made and what happened after I was advised at the workshop that that tree could be retained? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mayor McMullen, as part of our directive to the landscape architect, we did we did have a focus on trees and tree retention where we could. So I'm distinguishing trees here from shrubs and speaking specifically to trees. So you'll see from the plan that clearly there are some trees that are being retained. The big fig tree to the north and also a couple of street trees. But on the south side of the library, there are two existing trees, as you pointed out, one on either side. And unfortunately, the architect's position is that they can't be retained. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that they are very close to the building's foundations. One in particular is very close and has the potential to cause some issues with the building's foundations. The other tree isn't quite as close and under normal circumstances would probably be okay. And that's the tree I think you're referring to in that southeast corner. The issue there is that when the building was built, it actually has a suspended concrete slab with a brick skirt around the base. And over time, the natural ground level has been built up around that brick skirt. And there's now a tiered garden bed, which is retained. And that's been backfilled with soil and shrubs have been planted and it's reticulated. And basically what it's doing is it's holding water and that's affecting the building's foundations and there are issues with rising and falling damp. So it's really important that the tiered garden beds are actually removed in order to let that brick skirt and the slab breathe. And so you can imagine a situation where you take away the tiered garden bed, there simply wouldn't be anything there to support the root system of that tree. They did look at possibly building something around it to retain the root system, but it just wasn't workable. So what they're proposing is to replace those two trees with new tree species that are more appropriate. So they will be replaced, but unfortunately the position that they landed on was that they couldn't be retained.
Councillor Jennings, any further questions? Councillor Stroud.
Sorry, but now's the time to really do this. I think it's a pity actually when we had the workshop that when we had Phil Griffiths, we didn't actually, talk about, for example, the steps area. And for him to give a chance to talk to, if we weren't to go with the steps, what would be the alternative and how this area could be treated or what would be required to make it consistent with all the other refurbishment we're doing. So that is my question now. I'm happy to wait till we go to tender to decide whether I want steps or not, but I also need to know what the proposed alternative look would be. So can we obtain that so that we do have that? And does staff just take that on notice, or do you want something in an amendment or something?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think we can just take that on notice and seek, Phil Griffiths to provide a bit more information, probably invite him back to a strategic workshop. So councillors can ask him a range of questions, and that would no doubt help in terms of how we actually to put the scope of works together for the tender document. So it'd be an important part of what we need to do going forward.
Another question, thank you, through Mayor, because also on the last page of the indicative cost estimate, they're talking about removing, this is number 85, removing of additional paving around building to lower levels. I'm quite surprised actually how small that cost is. But I'm interested if that was part of the design of these steps because the gradient is so small. were they actually having, I had a good, that's why I was a little bit late today, because I was just having another good look at it, whether the intention is actually to lower some of the footpath paving, because it does go up a bit, to actually help make the steps. So I'll just put that out there, because maybe staff don't have the answer to that at this stage, but I would like to know that at some stage.
Sorry, Councillor Stroud. Mr. Guest, is that something you can comment on tonight?
Thanks, Councillor Stroud. Through you, Mayor McMullen. Look, I suspect it would be difficult for them to lower the footpath unless it's raised above the level of the road. I think we'll have to take it on notice. But just to be clear on the question that we're taking, is the question whether or not the intent of the landscaping design is to lower the footpath?
No, I don't think that was the question.
Okay, I'll move on. Look, the next question goes back to, I noticed that there was a quote for removing the staining on the building, and that's fair enough, because there obviously is going to be damp staining and so on. But you know, that never quite works when you try and clean up an area. It always going to look different from the other white and of the building. White, I put in inverted commas. So I'm wondering why we actually haven't included the consideration that the whole building will have to be painted.
Mr. Guest.
Through the chair, I think the heritage architect would be loath to paint the building. I think there is a section that was painted at a point in time around the back to cover up some graffiti, and I think he found the sight of that quite distressing. So I think the intention is to apply some sort of an acid wash treatment to the facade to clean the whole thing. So you would still achieve uniformity of finish. As I said earlier, there are probably some panels that need to be replaced, but I don't think it's the intention to paint it.
It's not currently painted. I'm trying to think how it looks. It's not actually painted. Okay, at the time, so it is just okay. I was thinking it was because it's sort of white, but it's just a white concrete. Okay. So we.
Councillor Stroud, it's a stone finish. It's like little chippy stones stuck all over.
Yeah, thank you. So, so it's a bit of cross fingers that by the time we finish the staining and everything, it's all going to look okay, because it's sure going to be out on show the way it is. Okay. My final question of the night is that it would seem from the answers I've got on this is that this is an indicative cost estimates only, and it is the competitive quotes of the tender that will bring this more into a realistic cost. But I just wondered, in this market where there actually isn't a lot of competition, we're probably, I'm just wondering how much really there is competition, how much we'll just be lucky to get someone to do the job because of the present construction industry, and whether it would have been wiser really to keep things like these indicative cost estimates confidential. I appreciate that the actual staff recommendation could be public, but whether it would have been wiser to keep this confidential. So I'm interested in a comment on that. Thank you.
Well, the scope of work hasn't been identified exactly, so that's the piece that still needs to be done. So when the documentation is done, that's when the firms will look at the detail of that. They're not necessarily going to go back to what a QS has said something might cost. They'll have their own estimators that will do that work. I'm hopeful, given this is quite a spectacular building, that there would be businesses that would be interested to provide tenders for this particular work, given the type of work that it is and restoring this building to its former glory. So we won't know until the tenders close. So we would just have to wait and see. I think I'm hopeful that there will be a number of tenderers, and it's going to be interesting to read, given some of the issues as to how they'll deal with certain materials. But I don't have a crystal ball. Things may have eased off a bit by then, but I think it's likely that the Perth building trade will continue for some time with all the things that are in the pipeline. So it may well be difficult, and that might continue for some time. So, but as I've said before, it's in council's absolute discretion as to whether it thinks that's value for money at the time that the tender comes in and is evaluated.
Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Member McMullen. Who's the anticipated project manager?
Through the chair, we would bring the architect on board to project manage, so that would be part of their fee.
That concerns me, but it's not a question, but I'll just leave it at that. Look, through your chair, and perhaps to the CEO, as you choose. I think are we getting ahead of ourselves? I think what I'm saying is whether it's something as which I think is important, but some people think of it and go, why is Councillor Power talking about stairs? But I actually think it's very important whether or not we have stairs or not, even on which way you lean. And I know Councillor Stroud is showing tremendous interest in this particular building. And considering we've got time, is there any feeling that we're getting ahead of ourselves here? I don't feel right about it. I think this is dreadfully important, and we're a step ahead of where we should be. I know we've had a workshop, right? I think a lot more information has come to the table, and people probably have a lot more questions about this, right? Is there any feeling from the executive that, the building's obviously been leaking, etc., and having all these problems for a long time? Nobody's cared. We've had, a roof up there with galvanised against other materials rusting away. We've replaced the ceiling, which was arguably the most important part of the building, with and didn't even keep one of the wheat battens as for historical reasons. So I don't want to see any mistakes made here. So again, the question is through the mayor. Can we just take a step back for a second here, or is there a reason we need to plough forward? I'm not trying to slow it down for eons. I'm just talking about just slowing it down a tad so we can get a better feel for this. Maybe some of the councillors don't feel for the building the way I do.
So perhaps I could answer that. Look, ultimately, council determine the strategic priorities of the organisation. I suppose if you're asking for my advice, is the time right? Is it appropriate now? I think most of the issues that are probably contentious are not contentious in this project. So there's only a few minor matters in terms of final design on certain elements that the elected members would like to have some more information, which can absolutely be dealt with. And I think I would encourage elected members to go through this process, and at some point in time, if you deem that it isn't a priority, or you feel it'd be better done at another time, you can do that before we obviously go to tender. But the idea is that we're asking to see whether this is a strategic priority. In my view, I think it's important from a number of reasons. One is obviously from an asset management perspective.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you've got my question wrong. I think you're questioning my consideration of its importance. I'm saying because it's so important that we should be taking a step back, not that we should be. You know what I mean? It's not going to fall down tomorrow. It's been in bad shape for a long time and has been ignored even since we Heritage listed it. We just still ignored it, right? I'm saying that it's the nature, the sheer extent of its importance to the city, right, is the reason we should be slowing down, not. You know, I mean, if I thought the building was in immediate danger, I wouldn't be suggesting this, but I don't believe that's the case. It's not going to be any worse off tomorrow than it is today. I'm just saying, you know what I mean, could we slow down a second to get a better feeling?
Councillor Burns, can I just clarify the question? Is your concern that we would be going to tender without necessarily having agreed a scope of work at a council level, because we're still talking about things like stairs and such, and yet we're going to be going to tender if we approve the recommendation. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, David, and I'm sorry to use your first name, but I'm going to give a casual answer. It's, you know what I mean, I want it really done properly. Okay, you know what I mean, it's tremendously important to me. So that's the nature, and maybe I'm having trouble expressing that. Maybe you can express it better for me, right? I just think we need more concern about even you know, I mean, Councillor Jennings' questions about trees. You know, they've been answered. Okay, sorry, she can't have the trees. Okay, now look, that's fine, but I just think we need. You know, I wouldn't care, you know, if somebody turned around tomorrow and said, look, actually, you'd be a hell of a lot better off spending $2.5 million on it, I wouldn't blink at a second, because I think we spend money on all sorts of things that I just think is an absolute waste. And if you said this building was going to cost $2.5 million, not $1.5, I wouldn't blink an eye at it, because I think it's that important. So I'm actually asking you to slow down, right, so that we get a better result, not move forward, because we need a result.
Okay, Councillor Burns, I think the staff advice is that we're not going ahead too quickly. I think that the task for us as councillors is to consider whether we put up an alternative motion or, you know, an amendment on between now and next week, and that's probably something you and others can take offline.
Okay, that's fine. I accept that. We'll do it all night otherwise. Thank you very much for tolerating me.
Okay, any other questions on this item before we move on? I reckon now might be a good time to adjourn for a short while, because we've been going since 5:30. Well, we've still got CEO performance review and an item behind closed doors. How are people going? I don't particularly need a break. Okay. Right, we'll keep going then. That's C7 done. C8, review of the Register of Delegations and Authorisations. Any questions on that item? Item C9, Financial Statements and Reports for the month ending 31 March. It's good we didn't have that break. Item C10, the CEO Performance Review, appointment of a panel. Any questions? Good. Okay, well, the next item I think we'll deal with confidentially tonight at least. It involves a proposed contract that at this stage is commercial in confidence. We don't need to have a vote to go behind closed doors, but we will next week. So what I think we'll do now, governance, is switch off the live feed, please. Okay, we'll just switch it back on. I declare the City of Subiaco Council Agenda Briefing Forum of the 24th of May 2022 closed at 8:41 p.m. Thanks, councillors, and thanks, staff.